Officer James had seen many things in his line of work, but nothing had prepared him for the call he received that evening. It was just another day at the station, the usual hum of phones ringing and paperwork stacking. He was used to the routine, but this call was different. The voice on the other end was frantic, almost desperate. It was the director of the local orphanage, Mrs. Harris. "Officer James, I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "We have 6 girls here, and they've been abandoned. We've called every shelter, every agency, but no one can take them in. We don't know where to turn. Can you help us?" James paused, his hand hovering over his pen. He wasn't sure what to say. 6 girls. Abandoned? His heart sank. He had heard stories about children being left behind, but never so many at once. "Are they safe?" James asked, trying to steady his own voice. "They're scared," Mrs. Harris replied. "They'd been through a lot, but I promised them we would find somewhere for them to go. And now, I don't know what to do." The weight of the situation hit James hard. He had always been a man of action, one who couldn't stand by while there was a problem to fix. But this wasn't just a broken window or a robbery. This was something much more serious. These girls had no family, no place to call home. James knew he had to do something. "I'll be there as soon as I can," he said, hanging up the phone without another word. He grabbed his coat, put his badge in his pocket, and headed out the door. The drive to the orphanage felt longer than usual. His mind was racing. How could anyone abandon 6 innocent children? What kind of life had they been living? When he arrived at the orphanage, he was greeted by Mrs. Harris, who led him inside. The girls were sitting quietly in a small room, their heads down, not making a sound. James could see the fear in their eyes, the way they fidgeted with their hands, as if they were waiting for something bad to happen. They didn't trust him yet, and James understood. How could they? Their world had just been turned upside down. Mrs. Harris introduced him to each of the girls. The oldest, Emma, was 15, and her eyes were filled with a sadness James couldn't explain. Then there was Lily, who was 12, with a quiet intensity that suggested she had seen more than any child should. The rest of the girls, Sophie, Grace, Mia, and Ella, were younger, but they all looked the same, broken, lost, as if the world had abandoned them too. "These girls need a home, Officer James," Mrs. Harris said, her voice almost pleading. "I don't know what else to do. They need someone to take care of them." James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had just fallen on him. He didn't have much experience with kids. He had always focused on his work as a cop, and his personal life was far from ideal. But something in his heart told him he couldn't just leave these girls here. They needed him, and for some reason, he couldn't say no. "I'll take them," James said, surprising both himself and Mrs. Harris. He wasn't sure what he was getting into, but he knew he couldn't walk away from this. Mrs. Harris looked at him, relief flooding her face. "Are you sure? It's a big responsibility." James nodded. "I'm sure. I'll do whatever it takes." The girls didn't know what to make of his words. They didn't trust easily, and who could blame them? They had been through so much already. But when James smiled at them and promised them safety, something in their eyes softened. Maybe, just maybe, this man could be the one to change their lives. That evening, James drove the girls to his house, the silence in the car almost deafening. He didn't know what to say to them. They didn't know what to say to him. But they all knew this was the beginning of something new, something neither of them was prepared for. When they arrived at his house, James led them inside. His home was modest, nothing fancy, but it was warm and welcoming. He showed the girls to the spare rooms, unpacked their bags, and tried to make them feel as comfortable as possible. But the girls were hesitant. They didn't trust this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. They had been let down too many times before. James sat down with them, his voice gentle. "I know this is scary, but I promise you, you're safe here. I'll take care of you. "You don't have to worry anymore." They all looked at him, their faces uncertain. He could tell they didn't fully believe him, but in their eyes, he could see a flicker of hope. Just a flicker, but it was there. As the night went on, the girls slowly started to relax. They ate dinner together, talked about small things like their favorite foods, and for the first time in a long time, they smiled. It was small, but it was progress. James didn't expect them to trust him overnight, but he knew this was the beginning of a long journey. A journey that would change not just their lives, but his as well. As he tucked the girls into bed that night, James stood by the door and watched them sleep. They had been through so much, and they didn't even know it yet, but they were about to experience something life-changing. For the first time in a long time, James felt like he was doing something important. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was someone who could make a real difference. He turned off the light and closed the door quietly. Tomorrow, he would do whatever it took to help these girls heal, to help them find a new beginning. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never give up on them. The next morning, Officer James woke up early, ready to face the new chapter in his life. He had barely slept the night before, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. But as he walked into the kitchen, he saw the girls sitting around the table, eating breakfast together. It wasn't much, just cereal and toast, but the warmth in the room made it feel like a real home. Emma, the oldest girl, caught his eye. She gave him a small, shy smile. For the first time, there was a hint of trust in her eyes. It wasn't much, but to James, it meant everything. "How are you all feeling this morning?" he asked gently, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The girls exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. Lily, the second oldest, spoke first. "It's okay here," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, understanding the hesitation. He wasn't expecting them to suddenly feel at home, but the fact that they were speaking to him was a step forward. He could see that they were starting to warm up, even if just a little. "I know this is all new, and it's scary," he continued, "but I promise you, you're safe here. I'll do everything I can to make sure you have what you need. We're a family now." The girls exchanged more glances, their eyes still guarded but a little less fearful. As the day went on, they slowly began to open up. James took them to the park, and for the first time in a long time, the girls smiled and laughed. They played games, climbed on the jungle gym, and enjoyed the little things they had missed out on for so long. Later, back at the house, James showed them around, making sure they had everything they needed. He made sure to check in with each of them, asking how they were feeling, letting them know they could come to him if they needed anything. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening after dinner, the girls sat together in the living room, watching a movie. James sat quietly, observing them. It was amazing how quickly they were adjusting, considering everything they had been through. They were still cautious, but the walls between them and him were starting to crack. Emma leaned over and whispered something to Lily. James didn't catch the words, but he noticed the way the two girls exchanged a look. It was the first real connection he'd seen between them, and it gave him hope. Maybe they were beginning to believe him, starting to trust that this time, things would be different. James smiled to himself, feeling a small sense of pride. The road ahead was going to be long and full of challenges, but he was determined to help these girls find the love and stability they deserved. As the night drew to a close, he tucked the girls in, one by one, just like he had done the night before. He kissed them goodnight and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them sleep. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. And that was all he needed. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring more challenges. But Officer James was ready. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing the right thing. The following days were a mix of challenges and progress. Officer James had taken on a role he had never imagined, and while it was difficult, he knew it was worth it. The girls were starting to settle into their new life with him, but it was a slow and steady process. They were still hesitant, still carrying the emotional scars of their past, but there was a change in the air. The first breakthrough came when James decided to take the girls out to a local fair. He thought it might help them forget about their troubles, even if just for a little while. When they arrived, the girls were wide-eyed, unsure of what to expect. But as soon as they saw the bright lights and heard the music, their apprehension seemed to melt away. They ran to the rides, laughing and shouting as they hopped on the Ferris wheel, the bumper cars, and the carousel. For the first time since they arrived, the girls looked like regular kids. They were enjoying themselves, letting go of their worries, even if just for a moment. James watched them from the sidelines, a smile tugging at his lips. This was exactly what they needed. A sense of normalcy, a chance to feel like they mattered, to feel like they belonged. Later, as they sat down to enjoy cotton candy, Emma, the oldest, finally spoke up. "I don't remember the last time I had fun like this," she said, looking up at James. Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of something new, hope. James smiled at her. "I'm glad you're enjoying yourselves. You deserve to have fun, to be happy." Lily, the second oldest, nodded. "It's nice here. I feel safe." James's heart swelled with pride. He had only been able to provide this much in such a short time, but it felt like a victory. The girls were starting to let their guard down, and he knew it was only the beginning of their healing journey. When they returned home that evening, the mood in the house was different. The girls were talking more, laughing at things that would have once made them shy away. Emma helped James with dinner, something she had never done before. Lily set the table. It was small, everyday things, but it was a sign that they were beginning to trust him, and more importantly, trust that they were truly safe. That night, after the girls went to bed, James sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the past few days. He had always been a man of action, but this was different. The responsibility he had taken on was huge, and he was still learning how to navigate it. But as he thought about how far the girls had come in such a short time, he realized that he had made the right decision. They were slowly but surely beginning to heal, and he was going to do whatever it took to help them continue on that path. The next day, James took the girls to a nearby community center for a support group for children who had been through traumatic experiences. He knew that the girls needed more than just his love and care. They needed to learn how to cope with everything they had been through. The group was small, made up of children who had been adopted or were in foster care, and they shared their stories and experiences. James stood off to the side, watching as the girls hesitated at first, unsure if they should speak. But as the session went on, one by one, the girls began to share. Emma spoke about the struggles she faced growing up, about feeling abandoned and unloved. Lily talked about the fear she carried, the constant worry that she wouldn't have anyone to rely on. It was hard for James to hear their pain, but it was also a necessary step in their healing. The girls were learning to open up, to let go of the emotions they had kept bottled up for so long. They were starting to understand that they weren't alone anymore. By the time the session ended, the girls were more relaxed, more at ease. They walked out of the room together, talking among themselves, sharing things that had been buried deep inside. James could see the change in them. The walls they had built around themselves were beginning to crack. That evening after dinner, Emma approached James. "Thank you for taking us to the group," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I didn't think I could talk about what happened, but I feel lighter." James smiled softly, his heart full. "I'm proud of you for sharing. It's the first step to healing." Lily joined in, her voice more confident than before. "It wasn't as scary as I thought. I think I might be okay." James felt a lump form in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The girls were beginning to believe in the possibility of a brighter future. They were starting to trust, to open up, and to heal. As they sat together that night, Watching a movie and sharing a bowl of popcorn, James realized that he had found his purpose. It wasn't just about being a cop anymore. It was about being a father to these girls, about showing them that no matter what had happened in the past, they had a future filled with love, safety, and hope. And as he watched the girls laugh and enjoyed the simple things, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the days passed, the girls began to settle into their new life more and more, but the journey was far from over. Officer James had grown increasingly protective, ensuring that they were all adjusting well, but he also realized that healing from their traumatic pasts wouldn't happen overnight. There would be setbacks, and it was up to him to support them through every challenge. One evening after dinner, Emma came to him with a troubled expression on her face. She had always been the most reserved, the one who kept her emotions hidden. But James had started to notice small signs, her body language, the way she looked down when certain topics were brought up. He knew something was bothering her. "Hey, Em, you all right?" James asked, his voice soft and encouraging. Emma hesitated before sitting down beside him. She shifted uncomfortably, but then took a deep breath. "I'm scared," she finally admitted, her voice shaking. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess things up? What if you end up sending me away like everyone else did?" James felt his heart break at her words. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. "Listen to me, Emma," he said, his voice steady. "You are more than enough. You don't have to be perfect. You're here, and you're staying here. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." She clung to him, her body trembling. It was the first time she had fully let herself break down in front of him. She had been holding on to so much fear, so much pain, for so long, and now, in the safety of his arms, she was finally allowing herself to feel it all. "I won't let you down," she whispered, barely able to speak through the tears. James stroked her hair gently. "You could never let me down. We're family now, Emma, and family sticks together. Always." Over the next few days, James noticed Emma start to open up more. She still had moments of fear, moments where the old wounds surfaced, but now she wasn't afraid to talk about them. She began to trust him, more and more, with the things she had kept hidden for so long. Lily and the others were also starting to show signs of improvement. They were beginning to participate more in daily routines, helping out around the house, and even starting to form deeper connections with each other. It was clear that the sense of security James provided was making a difference. But as much as he saw the progress, James knew they still had a long way to go. It wasn't just about making them feel safe. It was about helping them rebuild their confidence, to believe in themselves again. And for that, he would need to be patient and understanding, allowing them to grow at their own pace. One evening, as they sat together for another quiet dinner, James took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The house, once filled with silence and uncertainty, was now a place of laughter, of shared moments, and even of small victories. "Thank you for being patient with us," Emma said suddenly, breaking the silence. She was looking down at her plate, but her words were genuine. James looked up, surprised but moved by her gratitude. "You don't have to thank me. This is what family does for each other. I'm proud of all of you." It was then that James realized something profound. The girls had been through more pain and hardship than anyone should ever endure, but despite all of it, they were beginning to heal. They were starting to trust again, and although the road ahead would still be long, James knew they were on the right path. With each passing day, the girls grew stronger, more confident, and more at peace with their new life. And while James could never erase their past, he was determined to give them a future where they felt loved, safe, and most importantly, valued. As he tucked them in that night, James took a moment to watch them as they drifted off to sleep. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace too. The family he had always dreamed of was finally coming together, and he would do everything in his power to keep it that way. Weeks passed, and the bond between Officer James and the girls grew stronger every day. They were starting to find their rhythm, and life, while still challenging at times, was slowly becoming more normal. The girls were learning to trust him, and James was learning how to be the father they needed. But as much progress as they had made, there were still moments of doubt, moments where the past would rear its ugly head and threaten to undo all the hard work. One afternoon, as James was cleaning the garage, he noticed Emma standing at the entrance, looking out the window. Her posture was tense, and there was a look in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, one of fear, as if something was weighing heavily on her. He set down the broom and walked over to her, crouching down so he could look her in the eyes. "Hey, Em, what's going on?" he asked gently. She didn't answer right away, but her eyes flickered towards the street. James followed her gaze and saw a car parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and the engine was running, but there was no one outside. I don't know, but something feels off," Emma said, her voice trembling. James stood up and walked toward the window, keeping an eye on the car. He didn't recognize it, and it seemed out of place. But more importantly, Emma's reaction told him that it was triggering something deeper, something from her past. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Stay here, okay? Don't worry." Emma nodded, but her anxiety was evident. James could see it in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring smile and then stepped outside, carefully making his way toward the car. As he approached, he noticed the windows were still rolled up, and the person inside wasn't making any move to get out. James approached the car slowly, his instincts as a cop kicking in. He stood by the driver's side, making sure to stay visible but not threatening. "Can I help you?" he asked. The person in the car didn't respond, but James saw them flinch as if startled. After a long pause, the window slowly rolled down, revealing a man in his late 30s with a hard face. His eyes were dark and guarded, but they didn't hold any immediate hostility. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice rough. "I think I've got the wrong house." James didn't buy it. He stood there for a moment, watching the man closely. Something felt off. It was the way the man's eyes darted nervously, the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. "You sure about that?" James asked, taking a step closer. The man hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Yeah, sorry. Just got confused." James didn't believe him, but he let the man go. As the car drove off, he turned back to Emma, who was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Everything's fine, Emma," James said, though he couldn't shake the unease he felt. It was just some confused guy. But he wasn't entirely convinced. There was something about the way the man had acted, and it left him with a nagging feeling that didn't go away. Over the next few days, James kept a close eye on things. He was more vigilant than ever, scanning the neighborhood for anything unusual, watching for any signs that the girls might be in danger. But nothing more came of the incident, and life returned to its normal pace. However, Emma remained unsettled. James could see it in her eyes whenever she looked out the window, whenever she heard a car pull up outside. The fear she had experienced that day hadn't gone away, and it lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, as the girls were settling in for bed, Emma approached James, her expression serious. "What if the man comes back?" she asked, her voice trembling. James knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Emma," he said firmly. "You're safe here with me." She nodded slowly, but James could see the doubt in her eyes. He knew that it would take more than just words to make her feel secure again. It would take time, patience, and continued reassurance. The next morning, James went to the local police station to check the area's surveillance footage. He knew something wasn't right, and he needed to be sure. When he reviewed the footage, he was surprised to see the same car from the previous day, parked at a distance, but clearly watching his house. It was a gut punch, confirming his suspicions. The man hadn't been lost or confused. He had been watching, waiting for something. But what was he after? James felt a renewed sense of urgency. He couldn't risk the girls being in any kind of danger, so he took action. He called in a few favors, gathered intel, and began to track down the man who had been lurking around his house. What he didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of something much larger than he had anticipated. And as he dug deeper into the mystery, James realized that his protective instincts were only the start of a much bigger journey, one that would test him in ways he had never imagined. As James continued to investigate, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mysterious man had more to do with Emma's past than he first realized. Each passing day brought a new layer of uncertainty. The tension in the air was palpable, especially for Emma, who seemed to grow more and more distant. Despite his reassurances, she couldn't completely let go of the fear that someone from her past was still lurking nearby. James spent countless hours at the police station, cross-referencing records, checking for connections, and following up on every lead he could find. But everything seemed to lead to dead ends. No one recognized the man, and the car's registration came up clean. It was as if the person who had been spying on them had simply disappeared into thin air. Still, James wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't afford to. Not when Emma's safety was on the line. Every time he looked at her, he saw the vulnerability in her eyes. The same vulnerability he had seen in his own daughter when she was a little girl, the same fear that haunted the girls he had adopted. He knew the trauma they had all faced wouldn't just vanish. It was up to him to help them heal and to keep them safe. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, James sat in the living room, staring at the file in front of him. The case was going nowhere, but he wasn't willing to just drop it. He glanced at the clock, realizing that it was already past midnight. He hadn't even realized how late it had gotten. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, expecting to see a message from one of his colleagues. But the number was unfamiliar. He hesitated before answering. "Hello. Is this Officer James?" The voice on the other end was low and gruff. "Yes, who's this?" There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again. "You don't know me, but I know you. I've been watching your family, officer, watching you." James' heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down his spine. It was the voice he had been dreading. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're too late, officer," the voice replied coldly. "They're already here. And now, they know everything about you." James' blood ran cold. Who was this person? And what did they mean by they? He wasn't about to let this person intimidate him. Not when his family's safety was on the line. "What are you talking about?" James demanded, trying to keep his cool. But the voice just chuckled, a dark, sinister sound. "You'll find out soon enough. Just remember, I warned you." And with that, the line went dead. James stared at his phone, his mind racing. He knew that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be good. But what exactly did the caller mean by they? And how were they connected to his family? He stood up, pacing the room, trying to piece everything together. It was clear that this person knew something about him, something he hadn't shared with anyone. And somehow, they were connected to Emma's past. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound from the kitchen, a soft creaking, as if someone was moving around. James froze, his heart racing. Could someone have broken into the house? He moved cautiously toward the kitchen, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. As he entered the hallway, he could hear the faint sound of whispering. His eyes scanned the dark room, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. Then he saw it. Emma was standing near the kitchen counter, her back to him. She was staring at something in her hands, her body tense and her face pale. She didn't hear him approach, and when James spoke her name, she jumped, startled. "Emma," James said, his voice gentle but firm. She quickly hid whatever she was holding behind her back, her eyes wide with fear. What's going on?" James asked, stepping closer. "What's that in your hand?" Emma hesitated, looking down at the object in her hands. Slowly, she pulled it out from behind her back, revealing a crumpled piece of paper. It was stained with something, ink, or maybe something darker, and it was folded neatly. She handed it to him without a word. James unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the words written hastily across it. His stomach sank as he read the note aloud to himself. "You don't know who you're dealing with, officer. They're closer than you think. You'll pay for what you've done, and they will never leave." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The note confirmed his worst fears. Whoever was behind all of this wasn't just a random stranger. They were connected to Emma's past in some twisted way. And now, they had targeted his family. "Emma, who gave you this?" James asked, his voice full of concern. Emma shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I found it. It was in the mailbox earlier today." James stared at the note, his mind racing. He had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. Whoever was behind this was determined to make sure his family paid a price. With renewed determination, James knew he had to dig deeper. He wasn't going to let these people hurt his family. He had come this far, and he wasn't backing down now. As he set the note down on the counter, his eyes locked with Emma's. "You're safe here, Emma," he promised, though he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, and we'll find out who's behind this." Emma nodded, the fear in her eyes still present. But now, there was something else, a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. Together. James didn't sleep that night. The note burned in his mind, and the voice on the phone replayed over and over in his head. "They're already here. And now, they know everything about you." The sense of danger was more real than ever. He couldn't ignore it, not when his family was in danger. By morning, he had already contacted his fellow officers, demanding extra patrols around his neighborhood. He wasn't taking any chances, but he also knew that he needed to find out who they were, and more importantly, why they were targeting him and Emma. Emma seemed distant the next morning, her mind still preoccupied with the note. She avoided making eye contact with James, her hands shaking as she stirred her coffee. James didn't want to pressure her, but he could see the fear in her eyes. He couldn't let it show on his face, though. He needed to stay strong for her. The kids, oblivious to the danger looming over them, ran around the house as usual, filling it with the sounds of laughter and play. For a moment, everything felt normal again. But the truth weighed heavy on James' heart. He knew that everything could change in an instant. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his colleague, Officer Daniels. James quickly answered. "James, we got something," Daniels said, his voice urgent. "You need to get down here now." Without hesitation, James grabbed his keys and told Emmett he was stepping out. He had no idea what Daniels had found, but his gut told him it was important. He arrived at the station in less than 10 minutes. Daniels was waiting for him at the front desk, holding a folder. James took it without saying a word, his heart racing. He opened it, and his eyes immediately went to the first page. The report was about Emma's past, about her life before she came to live with him. It was shocking. James knew that Emma had gone through a lot, but the details he read in the report were far more disturbing than he had imagined. The people who had abandoned her all those years ago were connected to an underground network, one that operated in the shadows, dealing with illegal activities and darker dealings. "That's not all," Daniel said, his voice grim. "We found something else. Your name, your position as police chief. It's been mentioned several times in a set of files we found." James felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. His mind raced. What did this mean? How were these people connected to his work? And why were they targeting Emma? "We're looking at a possible organized effort, James. Whoever they are, They've been watching you for a long time." The words hung heavy in the air. James could hardly believe it. But deep down, he knew that the dangers weren't just coming from some random stranger. They were much closer, much more insidious. "I need to find out who's behind this," James said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We're working on it," Daniels assured him. "But be careful. Whoever's doing this is dangerous, and they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to stay hidden." James closed the file and looked at Daniels. His determination was unwavering. No matter what it took, he was going to protect his family. But he knew now that this was far from a simple situation. His new title, his new life as police chief, had made him a target, and the people behind it were not going to stop until they got what they wanted. As he left the station and headed back home, his mind buzzed with questions. Who were these people? What did they want with Emma? And why now? And most importantly, how could he stop them before they reached his doorstep? That night, as James stood in the dark hallway of his home, watching over his family, he felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't going to let them down. No matter what happened next, he was ready to face it head-on. He had to. For Emma, for his kids, for his family. The battle had only just begun, and James was prepared to fight until the very end.